Okay, thank you,
All right.
Nathalie.
Yes.
Right, so the question I just asked was how you got into ants, really. It's a very specific area.
Well, it's not that specific, but
Oh,
really, I was doing biology, and we had to do a literature review, if you wish, on a particular topic, and the topic was how societies handle conflicts generally. And so I started reading, assuming that I would find vertebrates more interesting, but then I realized just how fascinating social insects are, because you have colonies involving sometimes hundreds of thousand individuals that have to work together and sort of handle any conflicts that they have. Oh, sorry, that's a fire alarm.
do you need to go?
No, it's every week. It comes on for a few minutes.
Okay.
So anyway, I realized how fascinating the whole topic is of there we go, of cooperation and conflict management, and all the ways that they can keep this conflict down to make sure the whole colony works well. And so after that, we had to go into and do a few months of research experience, and I contacted a researcher on social insects, and I just loved it, basically.
Wow.
I got the bug.
A question occurs to me now. Do you get conflict within colonies, or are they always friends with each other and everything works perfectly?
Yes, you do get conflict within colonies, basically. Workers have a very high genetic relatedness with one another, so they are more similar to one another than we are to our own brothers and sisters. It's a particular mode of reproduction, but they're still different. And as soon as you have difference, you can have conflict. So social insects workers forego their own reproduction, and they help instead raise the sons and daughters of the queen. So that's very unusual in nature. Usually individuals have their own offspring, but in social insects, workers are sterile. But they may still have cases where they may want to produce their own sons and daughters, and this sort of conflicts can arise then.
So how does this, I only read this very recently, but am I right in thinking this? Some workers can become fertile, is that right?
It's the case in some species of ants, but not all. So primitive ants, such as ants that you can find, say, in South America or Africa, they tend to have very small colonies, and they don't have as much morphological differences between the queen and workers, right. Which means that indeed, if, say, the reproductive individual dies, then a worker can sort of step up and take that spot. But it is usually quite unusual among ants that this is possible. Usually the queen is very different, it's much bigger, it's got a different shape, different organs, which means that it's not replaceable by other workers. But in ants, all workers supposedly are able to produce eggs that can become males, whereas only the queen can produce eggs that become female.
Wow.
That's a little bit tricky, but that means that when the queen dies, any worker can then develop their ovaries and start laying eggs that can produce males, basically. So that is something that can happen.
Do we know how that transition happens? I mean, obviously it must be a hormonal thing, I presume, but
yes.
Is it pheromones that prompt it in the first place?
So usually they share the interest that the colony will do better if all workers work, and so the queen produces a signal, a fertility signal that tells all workers, I'm here, I'm fine, I'm doing well, so you don't need to reproduce. And when the queen disappears, this sort of signal disappears, and then we don't really know exactly what physiological changes occur, but in some species, what happens is that the worker then start having dominance interactions to sort of establish a new hierarchy, and then the top worker will start producing eggs, whereas the lower workers will remain sterile and working to make sure that the colony does well as a whole.
Wow, amazing. But it would be the absence of the queen's pheromones that would prompt that, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
typically, yes.
Okay. Oh, how interesting. And then your particular study, I think, is epidemiology.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, it's trying to understand how social insects can sort of counteract the increased risk of transmission of infectious pathogen that comes with living in a very dense society. So they're all, like I said, very genetically similar to one another, more so than we are to our own brothers and sisters. They live in colonies which have a fairly constant environments in terms of temperature and humidity. It's all micro-controlled, and they have, you know, they live in high density, they exchange food bookily, and, you know, all these things mean that in theory they should be extremely vulnerable to epidemics.
Yeah.
And now we know that it is a problem for bees, for example. We know that currently there's lots of issues of disease in bees with, you know, new parasites that are coming and making the whole colony collapse. But in ants, for example, there's very little evidence in the wild of colonies that are collapsing due to epidemics. And one of the reasons for that is that they've got all these mechanisms, collaborative mechanisms that they use to prevent epidemics. So this is what is called social immunity. So insects have individual immunity like we do. So, you know, physiological mechanisms that come into play when a pathogen enters the body and to try and keep down infection. But in addition, social insects have all these sort of cooperative behaviors that they use to also decrease the risk of epidemics. So, for example, an ant that is infectious will tend to stay away from the colony to reduce the risk of transmission of the pathogen to its nestmates. Or an ant that has been contaminated externally by a fungus will be cared for by its nestmates. As nestmates will groom it to try and remove those infectious spores, and they will use formic acid to kill those spores so they become harmless, and then they will sort of try and care for that ant. And what I look at is how their whole organization, which is based on different groups of workers doing different things, which means that there's some sort of isolation between these groups, then that leads to bottleneck effects, if you wish, in terms of epidemics, with lower risk of transmission between those groups because they rarely meet in a way. So this sort of structure of the colony into communities decreases the risk of epidemics. And so that's what I study. I put little tags on the back of each ant so I can see what they're doing, who they're interacting with, and I can then get at the social network, if you wish, of the entire colony. And then I can sort of look at how this would favor or reduce the risk of transmission of disease.
Now, the colonies presumably are in the laboratory, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, how, presumably they don't have the freedom to create a nest in exactly the same format as they would in the wild, because
Indeed.
they go down deep, don't they?
Yes, that's true.
They're restricted. How much, I mean, do you have to make allowances for changes in behavior because of that? Or do you just accept that there's a restriction and that's the parameter?
So there's always in biology a tension between doing experiments in the field where you're closer to natural conditions, but you can't manipulate particular parameters in a controlled way. So you'll never be sure whether what you observe is due to a particular, you know, to the environment, or it's due to a pathogen. You don't know what's going on. There's too much complexity. And on the other hand, you can go into the laboratory. You have sort of experiments where only one thing is different, so you can really test for the effect of that particular variable. But you're necessarily in unnatural conditions that are somehow remote from reality. So you've got this trade-off between being able to control things and then know what causes what, and being able to be realistic. So what we try to do is to work on species which aren't too different in the lab that they would be in nature. So for example, we work on young colonies of ants. So in ants, the queen will usually have a mating flight and then start her own colony, whereby she'll lay a few eggs, and then you have a few workers emerging. And in the first stages of its life, it's quite small, one queen and a few dozens of workers, and it tends to be that the nest at that stage is not all that complex yet. So if you then study that sort of colonies in the lab, you're not as remote from natural condition as for a colony with hundreds of thousand individuals and a nest with hundreds of chambers.
Yeah.
So we focus on these sort of stages that we can replicate more or less in the lab. Yeah. But you put your finger on one of these sort of weaknesses.
And how do you obtain your new queen? Where do you get your queen from?
Oh, well, in black garden ants, they have this big mating flight in June, July. You know, all these flying ants once per year. Well, there are the queens and males that will form the new colony. So we wait for this to happen, and then we just take the queens, basically. Then we put them in cubes.
What, do you go outside and catch them in a net? Or
No, we wait for them to go back down. And when they're down, they're looking for a place to start a new nest. And so it's just a matter of basically picking them up from the ground and then giving them a comfortable location for them to start laying their eggs. So usually we put them in tubes, water tubes, and they start laying eggs this way, and they start their colonies in the lab.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So how many individuals do you have in the laboratory nests?
So usually we try to do our experiments with nests that vary from 100 to 200 workers, because that's what's sort of
manageable
in terms of tagging all the ants and then being able to track them. Yeah.
So let me ask the grim question. When the nest is getting too big, do you destroy that colony or what?
No, we sort of, I mean, in the lab, they never get to huge sizes because of the constraint of the size of the nest we give them and the food we give them. So we don't destroy them, no. We do destroy them after experiments if they've been exposed to a disease. We don't want then the disease to spread between colonies, and then we will usually destroy them then.
So that you expose them to disease, do you?
Yes.
As part, understandable. Yeah.
Yes, and then we try and have a look at what changes and what they do to contain that disease.
Yeah. Is there any form of euthanasia
we tend to freeze them so that it's instantaneous. We put them on dry ice, which is -80 degrees, and then they sort of instantaneously,
Okay. No, I actually meant between the ants within the
colony. Oh yes, euthanasia. That's actually quite interesting. And these ants, they have this care versus kill trade-off. So their first reaction will be to try and care for infected individuals if they can save them. If the infections become so high that there's no chance of saving that ant, and then the ant is a threat to the rest of the colony, then if the infected ant is an adult, then usually that ant will make the decision itself to go away and isolate themselves. But if that ant is, say, a larva or pupa, which cannot move, then if the infection is high, the other adults do detect that, there's an infection going on that we can't cure, and then they will euthanize these larvae. So
how would they do that? What method would
they bite them, they dismember them, and they drench them in formic acid to disinfect them. And then they remove all these little disinfected bits. It's pretty grim. And the pupae and larvae actually emit a signal voluntarily to say, hey, I'm a danger to the rest of the nest now, kill me. So that is the sort of things that's so different for ants. They have this altruism. As they're not sort of reproducing themselves, they get their fitness benefits by making sure that the queen can reproduce, and that goes through making sure the colony doesn't collapse.
So is it, go on. Is it correct to think of the whole colony really as a single organism?
Yeah, it's a comparison that is more and more done. We call that a super organism, where you can compare the queen to our own reproductive organs and the workers to the cells in the rest of our body, which, you know, our own cells have a mechanism of programmed cell death. It's if, you know, if the cell doesn't work anymore, then it will go into this programmed death. And that's actually in cancer, that's one of the mechanisms that doesn't work anymore when this programmed death doesn't work and the cells sort of expand uncontrollably. Then that's anyway, I'm digressing, but you're right.
I thought it was fascinating. Yeah. So in fact, you prompted a question I was going to ask. Is there anything from your research that might give you or someone else insight into human behavior or into epidemiology in humans or other types of animals in other mammals or, you know, other kingdoms of life?
So I'm always very careful with that. We are not ants. Ants have this altruism whereby they're ready to self-sacrifice for the good of the colony, which in humans would be very unethical. In humans, we try to save every individual. So there are limits to what we can see. On the other hand,
are there communities where I mean, I don't know whether this still happens, but I've heard about communities where the elderly, when they reach a certain point, will go and take themselves away.
I don't know. That's something that is outside of my expertise, what humans do. But
well, I don't think it's completely absent. But anyway, you could carry on. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, there is some theories that suggest that the sickness syndrome in humans, whereby when we're sick we don't move very much, has partly been selected to protect our kin. If we don't move as much, and we won't infect as many others. But I would say that's disputed because sickness can also be a sort of side effect of you devoting your resources to fighting the disease, and so you don't have anything left to go and socialize. So to take with care.
Interesting. I've never thought of that, but it is an interesting side effect of a benefit as it
exactly. And there's quite a lot of work on that in mammals, trying to say that this sickness syndrome is partly a altruistic behavior to protect a kin from infection. But we would never sort of expect humans to kill themselves in order to protect the group, for example. So on that side, what we can learn from the ant is limited. But on the other hand, all those epidemiological processes whereby a disease will spread faster if everyone interacts randomly, or sort of proactive social distancing that you can see in ants. When a disease enters, you have a greater separation between nurses and foragers. Now, these are sort of generic ways of decreasing epidemic risk, which we also find in humans. So quarantining, and we've done social distancing during COVID as well to try and decrease transmission. So on those sort of more generic processes, we can use ants as a experimental system to test some global questions. So will this sort of social structure favor epidemics compared to that sort of structure? If we manipulate the nest to remove these connections, do we sort of successfully prevent an epidemic? So those are the sort of question we can use ants as a model to answer. question that could be useful for humans.
Now, what about mysteries? Are there things about your area of study that you just think, I do not understand what is going on here? Or do you have a fairly good grasp of how a colony works and how?
Well, there's always unsolved questions. What we're looking at the moment is a shaking behavior that the ants shake a lot, and we're trying to figure out sort of what they're trying to communicate. Is this a general alarm behavior? Is this something that's meant to spread to the whole colony so they can be put on alert once there's a threat?
Wow.
So that is what we're trying to look into at the moment, trying to understand the role of this shaking behavior.
And I mean, has this been observed before, or are you the first to observe it?
It has been, similar behavior has been described in termites. So termites do a lot of vibration to communicate, and some of them use that to communicate about disease threat. But in ants, it's been understudied. So, you know, often it's something new for the species you're studying, but that has been sort of studied in different species. So it's not entirely new.
Interesting. And when it happens, is it just one individual, or does it spread? Does the behavior
So that's
spread?
what we're trying to establish. Does it spread, and how far does it spread? And then does it cause changes in behavior down this change of spreading? We don't know yet. So that's under study at the moment.
So now I'm very naive about this. Could you actually have a dead ant on the end of a stick and shake it, and would the other ants respond? Or
maybe we'd have to optimize the protocol for them to sort of be fooled and interpret that shake as in the same way as they would interpret a real shake. And one of the problems is that dead ants have a smell that the others can detect, and they would normally try and remove a body. But perhaps down the line we will try and produce these shakes and see if we can start a cascade.
How long is the shaking? Just a few seconds, or is it prolonged?
It's actually a few milliseconds. It's very short. It's a sort of bump, a little sort of signal.
Oh, wow. Okay. And the queen you've never observed the queen do it?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, how interesting. Because you can sort of, I mean, I've written a song about the waggle dance, the bees waggle dance.
Ah, yes. So it's probably nothing as sort of refined as a waggle dance, but it's more like head bumps, if you wish.
It's more like what? Sorry.
Head bumps, if you wish, in the ants. It's probably it's not as rich a message as what we have in bees.
No. You okay?
Yeah, sorry, I've got a bit of a cold.
Cold.
Long-standing cold.
Is your daughter?
I must say as well that I'm in back-to-back meetings this morning, so in 3 minutes I'll have another student at my door.
That's fine.
I hope
that's fine. This has been absolutely fascinating. I might have some more questions to send you by email, maybe, but that's a really great start. And is there any chance you might be able to do a science cafe for us? I
have a young child, so it's difficult for me to, go down and at least at the moment, I don't have any plans to go in this area.
No.
But
what about an online? Because we do both. We both do.
I could do an online one. Yes.
Online one.
Yes.
So maybe I'll email you a few dates.
Yes.
We usually go for the 4th Friday of the month.
All right.
Although actually for the online ones, I'm changing that. I'm going to because I want to try and have the in-person ones every month.
Yes.
So for the online ones, they probably be the 2nd Friday of each month.
Okay.
Friday evenings, sort of okay for you?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
That would be brilliant. I think people find that really interesting because this Friday we've got someone from Italy talking about spider silk, and I'm really interested to know about that.
That would be fascinating. I think.
I'll send you the details in case you can join us. That'd be great. Anyway, Nathalie, that's so interesting. Such a fascinating area of work that
Thank
you're
you.
doing, and thank you very, very much for your time.
You're
And
welcome. And well, I'll be waiting for your email then.
lovely. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.